Alexander the Great. That name is etched deeply in history as one of the greatest conquerors the ancient world ever witnessed. Born in Pella, he rose from a small kingdom on the edge of the Greek world to become the man who changed the map of an entire era. Under the initial guidance of Philip II of Macedon, Alexander inherited an elite army, but it was he who turned it into an unstoppable war machine. From the battles of Granicus, Issus, to Gaugamela, he defeated Darius III and wiped out the mighty Persian Empire, a feat that previously seemed unimaginable. He marched through deserts, crossed mountains, and traversed unfamiliar lands, bringing not only soldiers but also Greek culture, ushering in an unprecedented era of East-West cultural fusion in history. In Egypt he was honored as a god. In Asia he was seen as a king of kings. Alexander's empire stretched from the Mediterranean all the way to India, encompassing millions of people from many different civilizations. He was not only a military genius, but also a symbol of boundless ambition, a man who believed no limit could stop him, and in the eyes of many, he reached heights no human before him had ever achieved. But in 323 BC, in Babylon, the image of Alexander was no longer that of an invincible conqueror, but of a man gradually being consumed by everything he had created. His born on the 10th of March of this fusism relentless warfare, his spirit eroded by losses that no victory could compensate for. He killed his close friend Cleitus the Black in an uncontrollable fit of rage, and spent the rest of his life living with that memory. He lost Hephaestion, his one true confidant and closest companion, and from then on fell into a profound grief that no one could share. The men who once fought by his side began to fear him, to doubt him, and ultimately were no longer willing to follow him to the ends of the earth. The empire he built through sheer will and strength had no foundation to survive without him, and even in his final days, as his generals stood around his bed waiting for a decision, Alexander could not give a clear answer about the future. The greatest paradox of his life gradually emerged. A man who could conquer nearly the entire known world, yet could not hold on to those closest to him, could not control his own fate, and could not ensure that what he created would endure after he was gone. If you want to continue exploring the journey full of ambition, triumph, and tragedy of Alexander the Great, please hit subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next parts. Alexander was born in Pella in 356 BC, in an environment where power was not something inherited peacefully, but something that had to be seized and defended through strength. The kingdom of Macedon, under Philip II of Macedon, was unlike the other Greek city-states, where politics were usually run through assemblies and laws. Here, everything revolved around the person of the king, the army, and absolute loyalty. But precisely because of that, any sign of weakness could lead to collapse. Philip II was a warrior, a military reformer, and a conqueror who transformed Macedon from a despised backwater into the leading military power in the region, and his presence cast a gigantic shadow over Alexander's childhood. From a very early age, Alexander was not just seen as a royal child, but as the heir to a power system built on warfare, and that meant he had to prove himself worthy, not only to others but to his own father as well. But if Philip represented practical strength, then Olympias, Alexander's mother, represented a different kind of power, the power of belief, of myth, and of stories about divine origins. Olympias believed her son was no ordinary person, but a descendant of Zeus, and she did not hesitate to instill in Alexander's mind the idea that he was born with a special destiny, a destiny that transcended all ordinary human rules. The combination of a pragmatic father and a highly symbolic mother created a nurturing environment that was both motivating and intensely pressurizing, where Alexander was both encouraged to become great and forced to become great in order to survive. His family was not a safe place, but a miniature battlefield, where political marriages, extramarital relationships, and temporary alliances constantly shifted the balance of power in the court. Philip had multiple wives, and each marriage carried the risk of producing a new heir, a direct threat to Alexander's position. This made him grow up in a state of constant vigilance where being replaced was not a distant possibility, but a reality that could happen at any moment. The tensions between Philip and Olympias made the situation even more complicated as their relationship gradually fractured, bringing division to the court and within the family itself. Alexander not only had to learn how to become a warrior or a leader, but also how to navigate an environment full of intrigue, where loyalty always came with conditions and betrayal could come from those closest to him. It was in that context that a psychological pattern began to form, the fear of being replaced when hand in hand with the ambition to outshine everyone, a belief that only absolute greatness could ensure safety. Alexander was not raised to seek balance or a normal life. He was raised to win, to stand out, to never come in second. This not only shaped how he viewed the world, but also directly influenced how he viewed himself and those around him. In Alexander's eyes, relationships were not just emotional, but elements in a larger game of power where every person could become an ally or a threat depending on the circumstances. And as he grew up in such a world, where power was at the center of everything and safety was always fragile, the pursuit of greatness was no longer a choice, but became an inevitability, a path he was compelled to take if he wanted to survive. In the context of a childhood overshadowed by power and fear, Alexander's education was not just about preparing him to become a king, but about shaping a person capable of rising above all ordinary standards. Around 343 BC, Philip II of Macedon decided to entrust his son's education to one of the greatest minds of the era, Aristotle, a choice that was not only strategic but also carried profound ideological significance. Under Aristotle's guidance, Alexander did not merely study philosophy, science, medicine, or politics, but was introduced to the entire Greek civilization, from poetry and history to the values of honor, reason, and order. This was the first time in his life that Alexander encountered a world not entirely dominated by violence and intrigue, but by thought and ideas. Yet this exposure did not diminish his ambition. On the contrary, it provided it with a much stronger rational foundation. Among everything Alexander absorbed, Homer's Iliad had an especially profound influence, not just as a story, but as a mirror for self-reflection. The figure of Achilles, the great warrior who chose a short but glorious life in exchange for immortality through fame, became the model that Alexander not only admired but wanted to recreate in his own life. He did not simply read the Iliad. He lived with it, carried it with him, and gradually formed the belief that glory on the battlefield was not just victory, but the only path to achieving immortality. In Alexander's mind, death was not the most frightening thing. The most frightening thing was to be forgotten. This belief began to shape how he viewed every decision, every risk, and every limit, making the pursuit of glory a principle of life rather than merely a choice. Parallel to this intellectual development were real-life experiences that reinforced Alexander's image as someone capable of controlling what others could not. One of the most famous stories from this period is the taming of the horse Bucephalus, a notoriously fierce horse that no one in the court could handle. While others only saw danger, Alexander realized that the horse was afraid of its own shadow, and by turning its head toward the sun, he calmed it and rode it in front of the entire court. This act was not just a personal triumph, but carried symbolic meaning. Alexander did not merely confront fear, but understood and mastered it, a quality that would follow him throughout his life. However, beneath these early successes and growing confidence lay an unavoidable inner conflict. Despite being educated in lofty ideas and demonstrating superior abilities, Alexander still lived under the shadow of Philip II of Macedon, a father who was not only successful, but constantly expanding Macedon's power in ways that Alexander could not immediately surpass. Each of Philip's victories added more pressure on Alexander. As they set a standard he was forced to exceed if he wanted to assert himself. This created a prolonged state of tension, where Alexander both learned from his father and quietly sought ways to outdo him, not only in achievements but in reputation. In that context, the idea of personal destiny began to take clearer shape. Alexander no longer saw his life as a series of random events or a path predetermined by others, but as a journey he himself had to shape and control. Olympias's influence made him believe he carried divine blood, while Aristotle's influence helped him understand that glory could be created through conscious action. This combination created a unique conviction that he not only had the ability to become great, but had the obligation to become great, as if his entire life had been designed to reach a goal far beyond what others could imagine. And from there, Alexander was no longer simply a prince trained to succeed the throne, but began to become an individual with his own vision, a man who believed his fate was tied to changing the world, no matter the cost. As Alexander entered his teenage years and began to clearly demonstrate his abilities, the relationship between him and Philip II of Macedon gradually shifted from guidance to subtle competition, and eventually to open confrontation. Philip was not only a father but a king at the height of his power, constantly expanding territory and consolidating Macedon's position in the Greek world. And it was precisely those successes that made the distance between the two increasingly tense. Alexander was no longer a child needing instruction, but was starting to become an influential figure in the army and the court, and this made his presence both a source of pride and a potential threat to Philip's political calculations. The simmering conflict erupted in an event clearly recorded in ancient sources, a royal banquet where the line between personal honor and political power was blurred, when Philip married another Macedonian woman, a strategic marriage to strengthen internal alliances. The issue was not just the marriage itself, but the possibility that it could produce a new, pure Macedonian heir, something Alexander, with his half-Epirote blood from Olympias, could not ignore. At the banquet, when one of the new bride's relatives openly toasted the prospect of a more legitimate heir, Alexander reacted immediately, seeing it not only as a personal insult, but as a clear sign that his position was being threatened. The exchange quickly escalated into direct conflict between Alexander and Philip, and in a dramatic moment, Philip, in a drunken state, reportedly tried to attack his own son but stumbled and fell before he could do so. This image, a mighty king, unable to stand firm before his son, was not only symbolic but marked an irreversible turning point in their relationship. Alexander left the court, carrying not only hurt but a clear realization that his position was no longer secure. For a short time he lived away from the center of power, observing and waiting, while Philip continued his campaigns, seemingly still fully in control. However, what happened in 336 BC changed everything suddenly and irreversibly. During the grand ceremony at Aigai, where Philip was holding events to display his power and prepare for the campaign against Persia, he was assassinated by one of his own bodyguards, an act whose true motive remains debated to this day. In that moment, the entire power structure of Macedon was shaken, and Alexander, only about 20 years old, faced a situation where any hesitation could lead to losing everything. There was no time for mourning, no space for emotion. Alexander acted almost immediately, supported by those loyal to him in the army and the court. Potential rivals, including other members of the royal family and those who might claim the succession, were eliminated swiftly and decisively, not as impulsive acts, but as calculated moves to ensure no power vacuum could be exploited. At the same time, Alexander also had to face external threats, as the Greek city-states, previously subdued by Philip, might see his death as an opportunity to rebel. In that context, securing the throne was not just an internal matter, but a message to the entire Greek world that Macedon's power remained intact. Alexander's first actions as king showed a clear understanding of the nature of power. It does not exist in a vacuum, and any sign of weakness would be exploited immediately. The transition from prince to king did not happen through ritual, but through action, through controlling the situation in those first unstable days. What Alexander had learned from the environment in which he grew up, that power must be held by strength, that hesitation is dangerous, and that loyalty is never absolute, was now applied directly and without mercy. And in that process a core principle began to solidify in his thinking. Power is not something given, but something that must be seized and held tightly, especially in moments when everything seems to be collapsing. The death of Philip II of Macedon not only created a power vacuum in the Macedonian court, but also shook the entire system of control that he had painstakingly established across the Greek world. And almost immediately, the city-states that had once been subdued began to see an opportunity to regain their independence. In many places, oaths of loyalty to Macedon were taken lightly. Quiet rebellions started to form, and rumors about Alexander's youth and inexperience spread like a signal encouraging action. In that context, the challenge Alexander faced was not just holding on to his throne, but proving that Macedon's power did not depend on a single individual, that it still existed and could even be stronger under new leadership. His first moves were decisive and swift as he marched south, reasserting control in Thessaly and forcing other city-states to recognize his position. But all those actions were truly tested when news of a major uprising in Thebes reached him. Thebes was not an ordinary city-state. It was a symbol, a power center, with a history of standing up to great forces, and its rising against Macedon was not just a military act, but a political statement that could trigger a domino effect across all of Greece. Alexander understood that if Thebes succeeded, the entire power structure he had just inherited would collapse. And so he chose a response aimed not only at crushing the revolt, but at creating an unmistakable precedent. He marched with astonishing speed, appearing before the gates of Thebes before many believed it was possible, and after a brief period of failed negotiations, he ordered the attack. The siege quickly turned into total devastation as Macedonian forces broke through the defenses and poured into the city. And what followed was not just a military victory, but a carefully calculated symbolic act. The city was almost completely destroyed, thousands were killed, and most of the remaining population was sold into slavery, a level of punishment far exceeding what was typical in conflicts between Greek city-states. This decision was not the result of impulsiveness, but a deliberate choice reflecting a clear approach to power. Violence was not just a tool for winning, but a means of control and deterrence. The message sent could not have been clearer. Anyone who challenged Alexander would not only be defeated, but erased. News of Thebes' fate spread rapidly across Greece, and the reaction of the other city-states showed the effectiveness of this strategy. Rebellious intentions were quickly quashed. Delegations were sent to reaffirm loyalty, and in a short time, Alexander not only consolidated his power, but established a new image of leadership, one that could not be challenged without paying a heavy price. However, along with the growing awe came an increasingly clear distance between Alexander and those he ruled. If before he could be seen as Philip's legitimate successor, a young leader full of potential, then after Thebes he began to be viewed as a force to be obeyed, not out of loyalty, but out of fear. This created a subtle but important shift in the nature of the power he held. It became more effective in the short term, but also more fragile in the long term, because it depended on maintaining an unchallenged image. Meanwhile, for Alexander, these events reinforced a belief that had already formed earlier, that the world around him operated by harsh rules where weakness was not forgiven, and where power only existed when it was continuously asserted. The destruction of Thebes was not just a military act, but a step in shaping himself as a leader willing to go to any extreme to achieve his goals. Someone who understood that in a world full of competition and instability, the choice was often not between good and evil, but between control and collapse. After power in Greece was solidified through unmistakable actions, Alexander turned his attention to the goal that Philip II of Macedon had long harbored, but never lived to carry out: the conquest of the Persian Empire, a colossal power stretching from Asia Minor deep into Asia, ruled by Darius III. In the spring of 334 BC, Alexander led his army to the shores of the Hellespont, the strait separating Europe and Asia. And when he set foot across those waters, it was not just a military move, but a profoundly symbolic act, as if he was stepping into a new chapter of history where all familiar limits were left behind. According to some ancient accounts, he hurled a spear into Asian soil as a declaration that this land would become his prize, a gesture clearly expressing his belief that this journey was not a gamble, but part of a destiny he had long prepared for. However, the reality Alexander faced was far from symbolic. He had only about 30,000 infantry and a few thousand cavalry, a tiny number compared to the near-limitless resources of the Persian Empire, where local satraps could mobilize armies from many regions. The first confrontation took place at the Granicus River, a battle where many of Alexander's advisors argued for delay due to unfavorable terrain and the presence of Persian cavalry on the high bank, but Alexander saw in it an opportunity to set the pace for the entire campaign. He decided to attack immediately, leading his forces across the river under difficult conditions and facing the enemy lines head-on. The battle quickly turned chaotic as Macedonian units had to climb the steep bank under Persian cavalry assaults, and it was in that moment that Alexander displayed the leadership style that had begun to take shape earlier. He did not just command from the rear, but charged directly into the front lines, fighting alongside his soldiers. There were moments when he was in extreme danger, surrounded and nearly killed, saved only by the timely intervention of his bodyguards. Such moments not only showed the level of risk he was willing to accept, but also sent a clear message to his army. Their king demanded nothing he was not ready to do himself. The result of Granicus was a victory, but not an easy or cost-free one, and that very fact made it more significant. It proved that a smaller, well-organized force led with determination could defeat a seemingly superior opponent, and more importantly, it reinforced the army's belief that they were part of a campaign that could succeed despite all initial predictions. For Alexander, this victory was not just a military advance, but a confirmation of the belief he had carried from his years of education and growth, that fate was on his side, that great risks were not to be avoided but seized. However, this belief also carried a potential downside, as each victory achieved by accepting high risk made him increasingly convinced that he could keep doing so, that ordinary limits did not apply to him. Meanwhile, the contrast between the small size of the Macedonian army and the vastness of the Persian Empire remained ever present, reminding him that the road ahead was not only long but full of challenges that a single battle could not resolve. Still, after Granicus, Alexander could no longer turn back in any sense, because he had placed himself in a position where stopping would be seen as weakness, and weakness in this context could lead to the rapid collapse of the entire campaign. The first cities in Asia Minor began to fall into his hands, some by force, some by surrender, and each advance pulled him farther from his starting point, not just geographically, but psychologically. He was no longer the young king who had to prove his power in Greece, but was gradually becoming a conqueror with an ever-expanding vision, where the goal was no longer limited to avenging Persia or completing his father's legacy, but began to take on the shape of a larger project, an effort to reshape the world in a way only he could envision. And in that process, every decision, every battle, every step eastward contributed to solidifying one reality. This journey was not just a military campaign, but a one-way path where every choice led farther, deeper, and made turning back harder than ever before. After the victory at Granicus, Alexander continued to push deep into Asian territory at a pace that surprised both allies and enemies alike, and that quickly led him to his first direct confrontation with Darius III at Issus in 333 BC. Unlike the local satraps he had defeated before, Darius was the king of a vast empire, and his presence on the battlefield carried not just military but symbolic weight, as if the entire power of Persia was concentrated in a single point. However, the terrain at Issus was not favorable for a large force, with the battlefield confined by the sea and mountains, significantly reducing the Persian army's numerical advantage. Alexander, once again, relied not only on tactics but on his ability to read the situation, exploiting this to deploy his formation precisely and leading the companion cavalry in a direct charge into the center where Darius stood. The battle unfolded with high speed and intensity, and as Alexander drew close to Darius's position, the decisive moment arrived. The Persian king, instead of holding his ground, fled the battlefield. This action not only shattered Persian morale but created a chain reaction that caused the entire formation to disintegrate. The victory at Issus not only gave Alexander control over a large part of Asia Minor, but also brought another symbolic prize. Darius's family, including his mother, wife, and children, fell into Alexander's hands. The way Alexander treated them, not harming them but keeping them in conditions of respect, revealed another side of how he viewed power, not just as destruction but as the ability to control and demonstrate power through calculated mercy. However, though the victory at Issus was a major turning point, it was not the end of the confrontation with Persia. Darius was still alive, and his empire remained intact in the east, meaning Alexander had to press even deeper. farther into lands he had never known. The decisive confrontation took place at Gaugamela in 331 BC, where Darius, having learned from his previous defeat, chose a vast, flat battlefield carefully prepared to maximize his numerical advantage and special units like scythe chariots. Here, the disparity in forces was clearer than ever, with the Persian army possibly numbering in the hundreds of thousands, while Alexander's force remained relatively small. Yet once again, Alexander refused to be overwhelmed by numbers. He deployed his formation flexibly, creating deliberate gaps to stretch the enemy lines, and when the opportunity arose, he led a precise strike into the center, aiming straight at Darius's position. The battle at Gaugamela was not just a clash between two armies, but a collision between two understandings of warfare, one relying on scale and overall strength, the other on speed, discipline, and real-time decision-making. When Alexander broke through the Persian lines and once more drew close to Darius, the scenario from Issus repeated itself. Darius left the battlefield, and with that action, he not only lost the battle, but lost control of his empire. After Gaugamela, the road to Persia's power centers like Babylon, Susa, and Persepolis lay wide open. And Alexander entered these cities not just as a conqueror, but as an heir to power. The Persian Empire, which had existed for centuries, collapsed at a speed that even those who witnessed it could hardly believe, and Alexander, in just a few years, had reached a position with virtually no equal. Yet it was at this very point, when all initial goals seemed achieved, that subtle changes began to appear in how he viewed himself and his role. If before he had been a warrior leading his army in every battle, now he began to act like the ruler of a vast empire, adopting Persian rituals, customs, and symbols of power. He did not just conquer territory, but began absorbing the culture and power structures of the lands he took, a process that was both strategic and reflective of a shift in his personal perception. The first signs of this inner transformation were not always obvious, but they appeared in small decisions: the way he dressed, the way he organized his court, the way he demanded reverence from those around him. To some, this was the sign of a leader adapting to the new scale of power. To others, especially his Macedonian generals, it was a sign that Alexander was gradually drifting away from the values they once shared. And in that growing gap, a question began to form. Even if unspoken, could the man who had conquered an empire hold on to himself? Or was the very greatness he achieved beginning to change him in ways even he could not control? After those decisive victories over Darius III, Alexander marched south, not just to secure strategic routes, but to solidify his position in the eyes of the ancient civilizations. And that journey brought him to Egypt, a land with the tradition of revering kings as divine beings. Here, Alexander faced no significant military resistance and was welcomed as a liberator from Persian rule, a reception that was not only politically advantageous but opened another opportunity to redefine himself. When he reached the Siwa oasis and participated in the ritual at the temple of Zeus Ammon, where the priests were said to have confirmed him as the son of the god, the event was not merely a religious ceremony, but became a turning point in how Alexander viewed his place in the world. Though no precise record exists of what was said in the temple, from that moment onward, his behavior and the way he was described began to change, as if he were no longer just a successful king, but a figure with a mission transcending ordinary humanity. This change did not happen suddenly but developed gradually through decisions and symbols, including his beginning to accept and even encourage forms of reverence foreign to Macedonian tradition. One of the clearest manifestations was the adoption of prosynesis, a Persian ritual in which people prostrated themselves before the king as a sign of near absolute submission. In Persian culture this was normal, but for Macedonian generals and soldiers, accustomed to seeing their king as first among equals, the ritual carried an entirely different meaning. It turned Alexander from a leader into a being they had to worship. Tension began to emerge not just in rituals but in the very way Alexander defined his relationship with those around him. He started wearing Persian-style clothing, organizing his court in a blend of Greek and Eastern traditions, and gradually building an image in which he was not just the king of Macedon, but the ruler of a diverse world where power needed to be expressed in many different ways. However, this transformation was not accepted by everyone. For many Macedonians who had fought beside him from the early days, these changes were not just a matter of form, but a sign that Alexander was drifting from his origins. They did not oppose the victories or the empire's expansion, but they began to question the cost. Did becoming the king of Asia mean abandoning the values that had brought them this far? In that context, Alexander faced a foundational choice, even if he never articulated it this way: to retain his old identity and remain a king in the Macedonian tradition, or to embrace a new role where he was not just a ruler but a symbol transcending different cultures. His actions showed he leaned toward the second option. He not only accepted being seen as the son of a god, but began to behave in ways that reinforced that belief, as if he believed that to control a vast and diverse empire, he needed to become something greater than an ordinary man. Yet this very decision also planted the first seeds of internal division. As the gap between Alexander and the Macedonians grew, not just in ritual, but in world view, the unity that had once been the foundation of earlier victories began to be tested. Those who had once seen him as a brave leader now faced a different image, a man demanding reverence not just for his deeds, but because he believed he deserved it. And in this transition from warrior to a near-divine figure, one question gradually became unavoidable: was Alexander expanding his power, or was he stepping onto a path where that power would begin to change him in ways no one, not even he, could predict? The change in how Alexander viewed himself and power did not just show through rituals and symbols, but gradually began to seep into everyday moments, where the line between control and loss of control became more fragile than ever. And one such moment occurred at a drinking party, where there was no battlefield, no cavalry or phalanx formation, yet it led to consequences more profound than any battle. Here, amid an atmosphere meant to strengthen friendship and unity, an argument erupted between Alexander and Clytus the Black, one of his closest friends, who had once saved his life at the Battle of Granicus. At first it was just back and forth words, but as with many events in Alexander's life, it quickly escalated into a conflict that was both personal and symbolic. Clytus, representing the old Macedonian generation, not only recalled the achievements of Philip II of Macedon, but also questioned whether Alexander was drifting away from the values that had made him who he was. To Alexander, these words were not just criticism, but a denial of the status he had built, and in the context of trying to define himself as a figure transcending tradition. This opposition felt threatening. Alcohol, which lowered self-control, combined with accumulated pressure from years of warfare and inner changes, created a reaction that even Alexander probably did not anticipate. Words grew sharper, tones grew tenser, and in a moment when time seemed to stand still, Alexander lost control. He grabbed a weapon and charged at Clytus, and before those around him could intervene, he had killed the very man who had once saved his life. That moment was not just an act of violence, but an irreversible turning point, where everything Alexander had been and was becoming collided in the most brutal way. Right after the rage passed, the realization of what had happened crashed over him, and Alexander, who had faced countless dangerous situations without flinching, now had to confront something he could not defeat with strength or tactics: the consequences of his own actions. He is said to have fallen into despair, attempting to harm himself, and had to be restrained by those around him, a reaction showing the depth of the remorse he felt. Yet no matter how strong the emotion, the reality remained unchanged. Clytus was dead, and that could not be undone. For those who witnessed it, this event was not just a personal tragedy, but a warning sign. If Alexander could kill a close friend in a moment of lost control, what guaranteed that others would not face the same in the future? Trust, already tested by earlier changes, was now seriously shaken. The generals and soldiers began to see Alexander not only as a great leader, but as a man who could become dangerous even to those closest to him. This event also marked a turning point in how Alexander wielded power. If before his violence had mainly been directed outward at enemies and opponents, now it began to turn inward, affecting the very people who had helped create his success. This not only changed the internal dynamics but also altered how Alexander viewed himself. He could no longer fully trust his own ability to maintain control, and while he could continue to lead and conquer, a crack had appeared, one that could not be hidden by victories or rituals. In that context, the power he held, instead of merely being a tool to achieve goals, began to become a force that influenced him in return, shaping his behavior and reactions in increasingly unpredictable ways. And from that moment at the banquet table, the question of whether Alexander could control the world was no longer the only issue. A more important question began to emerge. Could he still control himself when the very power that had brought him to the heights was now starting to reveal its capacity to destroy what he once considered unbreakable? After the death of Cletus the Black, the atmosphere in Alexander's court and army was no longer the same. As relationships once built on the battlefield and in hardship began to be replaced by wariness and silence, and in that context, any unusual sign could be interpreted as a threat. It was in such an environment that the affair involving Philotas arose. Initially just accusations of failing to report an assassination plot, but it quickly escalated into a larger investigation into loyalty. Philotas was no ordinary officer. He was the son of Parmenion, one of Macedon's most veteran and trusted generals, who had served since the time of Philip II of Macedon and played a key role in many of Alexander's campaigns. Because of this, the accusations against Philotas did not stop at the individual but quickly spread, raising questions about the entire network connected to him. During the interrogation, conducted under heavy pressure and harsh methods, Philotas was eventually convicted and executed. But that did not end the matter. It only opened the way for an even more decisive next step. If Philotas was seen as involved in a treasonous plot, then allowing Parmenion, who commanded a large force far away, to remain alive and in power would be an unacceptable risk in the logic Alexander was operating under. Without a public trial or chance for Parmenion to defend himself, the order was sent and he was killed. An action showing the extent Alexander was willing to go to eliminate any possible threat, even indirect. These events did not occur in a vacuum but immediately impacted the psychology of the entire army and leadership class. If loyalty had previously been built through shared victories and time, now it became fragile, because no one could be sure they would not come under suspicion at some point. An atmosphere of fear began to spread, not as open panic but as a subtle shift in behavior. Speech became more cautious, conversations more discreet, and distances between individuals grew wider. Meanwhile, for Alexander, these actions were not manifestations of gratuitous cruelty, but the result of a thought process in which the security of himself and the empire came above all else. Yet that very process also gradually changed how he viewed the world around him. People who had once been friends and comrades were no longer seen only through their past, but through their potential to become threats in the future. This shift did not happen in a single moment, but accumulated through many events, each reinforcing the belief that danger could come from anywhere, and that acting before danger became reality was the only way to survive. As a result, Alexander gradually became more isolated, not because he was pushed away by those around him, but because he himself created that distance. Those closest to him could no longer approach him as before, could no longer speak frankly without fear of consequences, and this changed the nature of leadership. A leader, to make effective decisions, needs information and feedback, but when those around him began to self-censor out of fear, that flow of information became limited and distorted. In that context, power was not just the ability to command, but the ability to perceive reality accurately. And that very thing began to be affected. Psychologically, a clear transformation was taking place. Power, which had initially been a tool to achieve goals, now began to shape how Alexander thought and reacted. The confidence that had once helped him win in difficult situations now combined with suspicion, creating a state where he both believed in his own abilities and remained vigilant about everything around him. Paranoia did not appear as a sudden emotion, but as a consequence of successive experiences, each confirming that danger was real and that failing to act could lead to serious consequences. And in that process, the boundary between protecting power and being dominated by power began to blur. as decisions were made not only based on reality, but on possibilities that had not yet occurred, but were seen as impossible to ignore. In the context of growing suspicion and distance between Alexander and those around him, a rare personal element appeared in his life when he married Roxana, a princess from Bactria, a remote region in the eastern part of the empire. This marriage, according to many accounts, was not just a political decision, but also bore signs of personal attraction, something rarely seen in the life of a man whose relationships were largely dominated by power and strategy. Roxana was not part of the Macedonian nobility, nor from powerful Greek families, and that very fact made this relationship stand out, like a moment when Alexander allowed himself to step out of the role of conqueror and become a human being with personal choices. However, even in this personal decision, the political element was never entirely absent, because marrying an Eastern princess also aligned with the broader vision Alexander was pursuing, creating an empire not only controlled by military might but bound together through cultural blending. From that point onward, his policies increasingly showed a clear intent to connect East and West, not just by retaining Persian officials in the administrative system, but through even stronger symbolic actions. One of the most notable was the organization of a mass wedding at Susa, where dozens, even hundreds of Macedonian officers were encouraged or required to marry noble Persian women. This event was not just a ceremony but a clear declaration of the direction Alexander wanted to take, an empire where cultural boundaries were erased, where former enemies now became family. However, for many of the soldiers and Macedonian generals who had followed Alexander from the beginning, fought through countless battles, and endured unimaginable hardships, this policy was not seen as progress but as betrayal. They had not just fought to expand territory, but to affirm their status as victors, and now, seeing Persians integrated into the power structure, married to them, and even treated as equals, they began to feel their sacrifices were being undervalued. The discontent was not always expressed openly, but it existed as an undercurrent, affecting the army's morale and cohesion. Meanwhile, Alexander continued down the path he believed necessary, drifting further from the original Macedonian norms. He no longer fully belonged to the world he was born into, yet he had never truly become part of the world he was conquering. In his court, he could blend Greek and Persian elements, but that blend was not always accepted by people from either side. To the Macedonians, he became too Eastern. To the Persians, he remained an outsider conqueror, existing between these two worlds, which at first may have been a strategic advantage, gradually became a state of isolation where Alexander no longer had a clear anchor for his identity. His marriage to Roxana, though bringing a personal dimension, could not resolve this issue, as it was only a small part of a larger picture, where every decision carried multiple layers of meaning and consequence. Psychologically, these factors combined to create a form of identity crisis, even if it was not always clearly perceived. Alexander, who had once been shaped by specific goals surpassing his father, conquering Persia, achieving immortal glory, now faced a reality where those goals had been at least partially fulfilled, yet they did not bring the stability or clarity he might have expected. Instead, he had to confront the question of who he was in a world he himself had changed. Was he a Macedonian king, a Persian king, or something entirely new, indefinable by old concepts? While his empire continued to expand and his power remained unchallenged directly, these questions did not disappear but lingered as a quiet pressure, influencing how he viewed himself and those around him. And in that state where power, personal emotion, and cultural change intersected, Alexander not only had to manage a vast empire but also face a far more elusive challenge, maintaining a sense of self in a world where the boundaries between roles and identities were becoming increasingly blurred. After attempting to reconcile the internal conflicts between power, identity, and loyalty, Alexander continued to push his army farther east, crossing lands that even the Persians before him had never fully controlled, and finally reaching the edge of the known world, the region of India. This was not just a geographical advance but a test of his own limits, because each additional mile no longer carried the familiar meaning of expanding power but became a question of how far he could still go. Here, he faced Porus in a battle at the Hydaspes River, a confrontation different from anything he had experienced before. The terrain was no longer favorable, the weather harsh with heavy rains making the ground slippery, and Porus's army possessed elements the Macedonians had never faced, especially war elephants, gigantic creatures capable of breaking formations and causing panic. Alexander, as usual, did not retreat, but adapted, using tactics to cross the river under difficult conditions for surprise, and once again led his forces into battle. The fighting was prolonged and fierce, without the quick collapse seen at Issus or Gaugamela, but a true test of strength between the two sides, where every advance came at a cost. In the end, Alexander won, and Porus, instead of being destroyed, was spared, and even granted rule under Alexander's patronage, a decision reflecting a mix of pragmatism and respect for a worthy opponent. However, unlike previous victories, this one did not bring a sense of completion or exhilaration. It felt like another step in a journey that had grown too long, too burdensome, and increasingly lacking clear purpose. For the army, those who had followed Alexander from Macedon through Asia Minor, Persia, and now India, the exhaustion was no longer just physical, but spiritual. The endless rains, difficult terrain, and battles without a clear end made them start questioning the meaning of pressing forward. They had defeated the greatest empires they knew, achieved glory and wealth, and now all that lay ahead were stranger lands, new enemies, and a road with no obvious stopping point. Meanwhile, for Alexander, signs of fatigue also began to appear, even if not always shown publicly. He still led, still made strategic decisions, but the motivation behind those decisions seemed to have shifted. If before each advance had been tied to a specific goal, defeating Persia, surpassing Philip II of Macedon's legacy, achieving glory, those goals had now been at least partly fulfilled, and continuing eastward no longer carried the same clear meaning. The feeling that there was nothing left to prove began to creep in, even if he may never have admitted it, and in that state, where ambition still existed but was no longer clearly directed, limits began to emerge. The army, the main tool for realizing his ambition, now had its own limits, and when they refused to go farther, it was not just a collective decision, but a sign that even the greatest power could not entirely overcome human reality. Faced with this resistance, Alexander could not simply impose his will as before, because that could lead to collapse from within. So he was forced to accept turning back, a decision that could be seen as strategic but also reflected a change in how he dealt with limits. The journey back was far from easy, as the army had to cross harsh lands, endure losses and shortages, and each step served as a reminder that the path already traveled could not be erased, but also could not be extended indefinitely. In that process, Alexander not only faced external hardships, but internal questions about what he had achieved and what remained ahead. And for the first time, perhaps more clearly than ever, ambition, the force that had brought him to the heights, also began to show that it had limits that could not always be overcome. The exhaustion that had built up in the army, already present after the battle with Porus, finally erupted into a stopping point that Alexander could not overcome with will or tactics when he ordered them to push deeper into India toward lands that, in his view, still lay within the scope of his unfinished ambition. However, this time the army's response was no longer silent endurance or obedience as before, but a clear and collective refusal. Those who had followed him across thousands of miles and through countless battles now stood before him, not as warriors ready to advance, but as men who had reached their own limits. They were not just physically tired, but spiritually drained, and more importantly, they no longer saw a clear purpose in continuing forward. For Alexander, this was an entirely different situation from any challenge he had ever faced. On the battlefield, he could defeat enemies with tactics and courage. In politics, he could eliminate rivals with decisiveness. But here, he faced the very people who had formed the foundation of his strength, and there was no way to force them onward without destroying the very basis of the power he had built. Conversations took place where Alexander tried to persuade them, recalling past victories, glories, and rewards still ahead. But those words no longer carried the same weight. In the end, one of his generals, Coenus, spoke on behalf of the entire army, not in opposition, but with a practical argument, that the soldiers had done enough, that they needed to return home, and that pressing on was no longer strategy but unnecessary risk. For Alexander, this moment was not just a refusal, but a direct clash between his individual will and collective reality. For the first time in his life, he had to confront a limit that could not be broken by determination or bravery. After days of reflection and tension, he made the decision to turn back, a decision that could be presented as strategic, but that, deep down, carried a sense of failure he could hardly fully accept. This was not a defeat at the hands of an enemy, but a defeat before his own limits and those of the men who followed him. The wound to Alexander's pride was not shown publicly, but it was present in how he handled the situation and in his subsequent actions. He ordered the construction of massive altars as markers of the farthest point he had reached, as if trying to turn the decision to return into part of a story of success. But the very need for such symbols showed he clearly recognized this was not a victory in the usual sense. At the same time, the distance between him and the army continued to grow. If before they could share goals and motivation, now the difference in how they viewed the world became clearer than ever. For the soldiers, turning back was liberation. For Alexander, it was an unwanted halt, a limit he could not surpass. This disconnection was not just about the specific decision, but about understanding their own roles. Alexander, accustomed to shaping reality according to his will, now had to accept that some factors lay beyond his control, not because he lacked ability, but because human nature and collective will have their own limits. And it was in that realization that a significant change took place, not in outward actions, but in how he viewed the world, that not everything could be conquered, not every path could be followed to its end, and that power, no matter how great, had points it could not overcome. After being forced to turn back at the edge of the world he once believed he could conquer, Alexander returned in a state no longer the same, where ambition still existed but was no longer guided by clarity. And it was during this period that the greatest shock of his life occurred when Hephaestion, his closest friend who had been with him since boyhood, suddenly died. Hephaestion's death was not an ordinary political or military loss, but a profound personal wound, because in a world where Alexander had grown increasingly isolated, Hephaestion was one of the few people he could trust completely. When the news arrived, Alexander's reaction was not just grief but an emotional collapse he had rarely shown before. He's said to have refused food and drink, unable to accept the reality, and ordered unprecedentedly grand funeral rites as if trying to turn personal loss into something eternal. These actions not only reflected the depth of their bond, but also showed that amid everything Alexander had lost on his path of conquest, friends, comrades, stability, Hephaestion's death was something he could not compensate for with power or victory. Yet this pain did not stop at mourning but began to affect his behavior and decision-making. Signs of loss of control, which had appeared earlier, now became clearer as Alexander increasingly acted on emotion rather than calculation. He continued to hold large banquets where heavy drinking became an essential part, not just as entertainment, but as a way to temporarily escape reality. But these very banquets, instead of providing relief, contributed to further physical and mental deterioration, as his body, after years of warfare and endurance, began showing signs of overload. Meanwhile, ambition did not disappear entirely but shifted direction. Upon returning to Babylon, Alexander began planning new campaigns westward toward Arabia and even farther, as if stopping had never truly been an option for him. Babylon, with its central position and wealth, became the place where he envisioned the next phase of the empire, a place from which he could continue expanding power and pursuing a goal that perhaps even he no longer defined as clearly as before. However, it was here, when everything seemed to be preparing for a new chapter, that his body began to react in ways that could not be ignored. After a series of events including feasting, stress, and exhaustion, Alexander suddenly fell seriously ill. At first it may have been just a fever, something not uncommon in that era, but his condition quickly worsened. In the following days, he gradually lost the ability to move, to speak, and finally to command, a decline happening right at the center of the power he had built. For those around him, this was not just a health issue but a decisive situation for the future of the entire empire. Alexander, who had lived through action, decision, and presence on the battlefield, was now forced to lie still, unable to control what was happening to himself. And in that state, where everything once under control now became fragile, the true cost of all he had achieved began to become clear, not through battlefield losses, but through the weakening of the very man who had created it all. In those final days in Babylon, as Alexander's body gradually weakened, and the power he had once held with iron will could no longer save his own condition, a question began to spread among the ranks of his generals and soldiers: what would happen when he was gone? There was no clear succession plan, no mature heir capable of taking power, and in that context, Alexander's death in 323 BC was not just the end of one man, but the beginning of an almost immediate process of disintegration. When asked to whom he would bequeath the empire, the recorded reply to the strongest was not a solution, but an invitation to an inevitable struggle. The men who had once stood by his side, who had shared victories and hardships, now became rivals in a power contest with no unifying center. The generals, later known as the Diadochi, quickly carved up the empire into pieces, each trying to control a region and consolidate his own power. Alliances formed and broke, new battles erupted, not to expand territory, but to seize control of what Alexander had left behind. In that process, the vast empire once united under a single will could not remain intact, because it had never been built with a structure stable enough to endure without its founder. Yet this fragmentation did not mean Alexander's legacy vanished. On the contrary, it ushered in a new phase in history, often called the Hellenistic period, where Greek culture spread and blended with Eastern civilizations in ways that had never happened before. Cities were founded, academic centers flourished, and ideas, languages, and customs began to move across vast lands, creating a more connected world, even if it was no longer politically unified. In that context, Alexander's image began to be viewed in many different ways, depending on the observer's perspective. To some, he was a figure who connected East and West, breaking down geographical and cultural barriers and creating a space where civilizations could interact and influence one another. Cities named after him, trade routes opened, and the spread of the Greek language were seen as evidence that he was not just a conqueror, but a creator. However, to others, his legacy carried an entirely different meaning. His conquests, while bringing connection, also destroyed political and social structures that had existed for centuries, causing losses that could not be measured merely by territory or cultural influence. Cities were devastated, dynasties overthrown, and communities forced to adapt to a new order they did not choose. In this view, Alexander was not a connector, but an imposed force of change where creation and destruction went hand in hand. Regardless of how he is seen, his long-term influence on culture, politics, and military affairs is undeniable. Militarily, the tactics and organization he used continued to be studied and applied for centuries afterward. Politically, the idea of a vast empire where multiple cultures coexisted under a common administrative system became a model that later leaders sought to recreate. Culturally, the spread of Greek language and thought laid a common foundation for the development of science, philosophy, and art in the ancient world. Yet alongside all those achievements, the question about Alexander himself remains, not easily answered. Was he a genius, a man who saw and accomplished what others could not? Or was he a tragedy, a man swept up by his own ambition, where each victory pushed him further from what he once was? What happened in his life, from resounding victories to moments of lost control, from cultural connection to internal division, shows that the answer may not lie at either extreme, but in the very complexity of the man himself. And when looking back on the entire journey, from a young prince in Macedon to the head of an empire spanning continents, perhaps what is most striking is not only what he conquered, but what he could not. He could defeat kings, overcome larger armies, and reshape the map of the ancient world. But he could not create a system that would survive after he was gone, could not maintain cohesion among those who followed him, and ultimately could not fully control the effects that power had wrought on himself. And it is in that contrast between the ability to conquer the world and the helplessness before personal limits that Alexander's legacy becomes both grand and incomplete. a reminder that even those who reach the heights of power cannot escape the basic laws of humanity, that he conquered the world but could not conquer himself. The story of Alexander is not just the journey of a conqueror, but a profound lesson about the limits of power and the price of ambition, something especially meaningful for American society, where individual success and the drive to rise are always highly valued. When looking at the specific details in the story, we see a clear paradox. Alexander defeated Darius III, destroyed Thebes to consolidate power, and built an empire stretching from Greece to India. Yet he could not control internal factors like anger, killing Clitus the Black, paranoia, executing Philotas and Parmenion, or the growing isolation within his inner circle. The peak was Hephaestion's death, which caused him to collapse emotionally, showing that even a man who conquered the world could not escape basic human needs: connection, trust, and emotional balance. For Americans, especially in highly competitive environments like business, politics, or technology, the lesson here is very clear. External success cannot compensate for a lack of internal control. A leader can build a billion-dollar company or reach a position of power, but if they lose the trust of their team or let ambition exceed their ability to manage it, that empire can collapse as quickly as Alexander's did after his death. Additionally, his attempts to blend Eastern and Western cultures while making his soldiers feel betrayed also reflect a familiar reality in modern American society. Change is necessary, but if trust and consensus are not managed well, it can create division instead of unity. Ultimately, the story poses an important question for every individual. What are you building a sustainable success, or just a series of short-term victories that cannot endure when you are no longer there? If the story of Alexander has made you reflect on ambition, power, and the price of success, don't forget to hit subscribe so you can join us in exploring more dramatic historical journeys like this one. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next video, where we continue to search for answers about the people who changed the world and themselves.